pushing for legislation at the local and federal level to ensure that every music company and entertainment film company has a financial, legal, and mental health service for all of their artists, and they're not exploiting artists for the sake of producing content. This idea has sort of been baking in my head for 5 or 6 years now, with my own mental health over the years, studying my grandfather's research as a professor of sociology, and really identifying gaps in how artists are currently struggling and where they're trying to go. And a lot of them just need a consistent support system that both believes in their art, but is the crux between their productivity and their artistry. So when you give them that system over the course of a month, you can kind of map out where their bouts of depression are, if they're having fallouts in sleep deprivation, where they're most creative, how well they're good at collaborating with other artists, and if you zoom that out on a yearly basis, then you can kind of plot, a customized wellness plan for each artist so that they can attain their goals for the next 3 to 5 years. The goal here is to build out relationships with each artist to ensure that they have full artistic autonomy. I think that's been our goal since day one. Really just make sure that the artist is fully communicating the ideas that they want from the beginning.
That is incredible.
Yes.
Bravo.
Thank you all very much. So I was thinking about Prince, and one of the things I've done in my class is I talk about social commentary and hip hop in particular, and not want to romanticize hip hop, and I'm very clear about strengths and weaknesses and the diversity of the field. You have artists who are feminists, you have artists who are misogynists, you have artists who are, who actually are hyper-capitalist, like super duper capitalists, and you have people who criticize capitalism and celebrate Marx, right? And people on all sorts of ideological spectrum. So, but when we think of social commentary in pop music, and while we might be able to go all the way back to, a change is going to come with Sam Cooke in 1964, or go back to Mississippi Goddamn with Nina Simone, also in 64, or Alabama with John Coltrane in 63, or Strange Fruit with Billie Holiday, or you go all the way back. We have all this stuff, and then so my students are grappling with all this stuff. Marvin Gaye, 1971, what's going on? And we have all this sort of like music, and then we get to the 1980s. So I asked my students, I'm like, all right, let's not look at hip hop. Let's look at what the black community was like in the 1980s. What sorts of issues were going on in the black community in the 1980s? And so the first third of the class, we're looking at the musical antecedents of hip hop. So they've heard all these names I just mentioned. And we get to the 1980s, you say, what are the conditions like with Reaganomics, right? What were the conditions like with social nets being like, shrinking, right? What was it like with deindustrialization, the rise of drug trades, all that kind of stuff, crime? So I said, okay, now what did musicians say about these cities? Like, so the communities from which they had come, what were they saying? So I said, name some black musicians outside of hip hop. And I have a list. I was doing this. These are the names that come from my students. New Edition, Whitney Houston. I love these people. Don't get me wrong. Anita Baker, Luther Vandross. I have all the albums. P-Funk, Funkadelic, Boyz II Men, Tony has done it again. So we have all these different people. People know Tony in the back. So we have all these groups from the 1980s. Good music, right? They weren't talking about any of this stuff, right? And so it turns out that the only one who's not, if you talk about rappers at that time, it's a different ballgame. So all these rappers were talking about these things. They're talking about more drugs, police brutality, crime, poverty. They were the ones talking about all this stuff. But there was the one pop artist who actually did. It wasn't, the discography wasn't huge, but who did engage it was Prince, of course. And so we have, like, in addition to a song, Controversy, this one of his best albums, if not the best album, is all up for debate, right? But Sign of the Times is a brilliant double album. And if you haven't had it, want to hear some more classic Prince. But Sign of the Times, the title track, he talks about all these things.
Yeah.
This is like 86, I believe it came out.
Uh,
86, 80, around, I think it's like 86.
Later.
Later, 86,
Graduated
87?
high school like 87, so it was.
So around like 87, okay.
Yeah.
And so when you listen to Sign of the Times, he is one to do something kind of bucking the trend of art of 80s pop musicians and making some commentary about this. And I was kind of thinking about if you see Prince, if there's a way to sort of examine Prince as a text, right? Sort of a visual text as well, and what he might, because I'm thinking about his aesthetics, which you made allusion to. That he was disruptive in those ways too.
Yeah.
Like aesthetically, one might say he is a descendant of like Little Richard. He has some Jimi Hendrix. He has some James Brown. Kind of has all that kind of there. He has his own stuff there. What can you say about other ways that Prince may have been socially disruptive? Right? Not necessarily, social change, but in ways that he might have been socially disruptive in aesthetics and his music.
I mean, the things that come to mind, well, yes, we were talking about, he's wearing high heels and, the kind of gender fluidity that I feel like now young people are embracing much more. But I was just thinking musically, Jimi Hendrix was Jimi Hendrix, but in the 80s, everyone was going crazy for hip hop. And if you liked R&B, it was Luther Vandross. But here's this other guy who's killing it on the electric guitar, but he's not heavy metal. He's doing something a little different. And I just, for me, that's this social commentary. Partly is like, I'm not going to be, based on my race, your perception of my gender, whatever it is, going to have my music sound a certain way. And I just know that for some folks socially that was important. It wasn't, the 80s for me were a little different. Maybe you probably have better examples, but Prince wasn't the person that was going to be interviewed and speak up on social issues and all of these talk shows or something like that. He wasn't quite out there like other, actors or something at the time. So, I just think it was, so it was always happening through the work, I guess is what I'm trying to say, right? It wasn't a lot of talk, it was always coming through in the songs and the persona and the apparel and things like that. And it wasn't about standing on a soapbox. It was sort of performing it and being it. But you may know more specifically if there was something he spoke about or on the social justice side than I do. But
I think of when I think of Sign of the Times, I think of how he's the first to, I know, not even a rapper to name check Disciples, right? The Chicago street gang, infamous, still around, and at one point the largest, right? And so, but he does that in Sign of the Times. Of course, he makes reference to AIDS, the AIDS epidemic, not by name, a big disease with a little name. And so he talks about crack, and so he does talk about many of the things that hip hop artists were already engaging in, uniquely so, right? Yeah. And it is it's kind of interesting that, and I don't think that Luther Vandross and Anita Baker and Boyz II Men were not good because they weren't talking about these things, because music is open for all sorts of expression. But it was kind of conspicuous that it was sort of wholly absent from other black art forms and then hip hop artists, which have always had sort of reverence, and which makes me take the shift to thinking about the intersection with hip hop in particular and athletes. And you mentioned Shaquille O'Neal, and I don't know how many people here know about Fushnikins from back in the day. I don't know how many seasons we know that. So Fushnikins, there's a style of hip hop that came out before you were probably a little, you might not even be born yet. You weren't even born yet. So there was I think it was Lords of Underground, came out with this sort of delivery style that then ended up getting picked up by groups like Fushnikins, and there's another group that had this sort of this style of delivery. And Shaquille O'Neal was the hottest thing in the NBA when he came out, and it was like about 94 did he come out, 93, 94, something like that at LSU. But he in an interview said that, you know, here he was, this #1 draft pick and this superstar coming out into the NBA. But in interviews, he was like, I can do all sorts of things. He said, I can act, I can rap, and he told this newsman, he said, I might even take your job, you know. And he actually became a sportscaster as well later on, right? But he was like, you know, I can do anything. And I really enjoyed his bombastic, sort of his bravado, his confidence. But he actually said that he loved, they said, well, you like hip hop, which group do you really enjoy? He said, I like this group, Fushnikins. Fushnikins reached out to him, they put him on this album, and for as far as I know, and maybe there are some other folks, he's the first athlete, a professional athlete who actually got on wax and started rapping, and that was early. And I think about moving up, you know, a decade later. I guess you have Meta World Peace, and so you have, you know, you mentioned Antonio Brown, and I guess there are a whole bunch of artists who have tried their hand at it. What do you think the connect? Because unless I'm missing it, maybe there are athletes who went and did country songs as well, or maybe did some NASCAR dudes who did some songs and stuff, or maybe some people who did gospel and R&B songs. I don't know. But I do know with hip hop, there's a lot. Can you talk a little bit about, and maybe country and gospel have a whole bunch as well, but and if not, why hip hop in particular? And speak a little bit more about these connections.
Well, I think there's a congruence in some of the experiences that professional athletes, especially in the NBA, face, and that of hip hop artists. There's kind of this idea that to make it out of your community, you want to find some level of success with your artistry or your athleticism. And I think that both groups can appreciate the time, effort, and energy that it takes to reach the top and to arrive at the pinnacle. And also, they run around in very similar circles. I think like the major cities, when we think of sports teams, we think of LA, we think of New York, and maybe every now and then, like, you know, Miami, those major cities. Likewise, a lot of the best artists that we know spend the majority of their time in these major markets: New York, LA, Chicago is another place. Shout out to your hometown, and Miami. So I think that when you have that level of fame, when you have that level of fortune, when you have that skill and time that you took to curate your craft, there's a joint appreciation that both groups have, and I think that's probably why they've run around in the same circles. And athletes also want to try new things. Athletes are not a monolith, and I think in America we tend to specialize in whatever field that we're in. We create a career. Or we think about, you know, if I am an athlete, this is all I can do, and I think people place that stereotype very easily on athletes in general. I can speak for my own experience, especially being at a place like Yale, where, you know, people were always questioning. There was a deficit of credibility as an athlete and academic being there. So what I can say is that when you want to try something new and you have a platform to try something new, and also some wiggle room financially as well to maybe fund your career and work with the top and the best people, and they also want to work with you, it's not as difficult to get into said field. So those are my thoughts.
Great. All right. You know, when I was thinking about, we made the commentary earlier about mental health, and I was taking notes as you all, and I thought about, you know, Sherrod, who's I guess she's a rapper, and are you familiar with Sherrod? Is she?
I'm not.
All right. And she has some incredibly rich songs about her struggles with mental health. And she was a cutter. And so in her video, she talks about, you know, coming through these really tough periods of her life. But she bears these scars. Even in her video, she talks about this and how this is something that's a reminder of, you know, from where she's come. And then I just thought about like all these mainstream artists, from, you know, Tupac, Logic, of course, most recently with this song about you know, suicide and hotlines, and of course Kanye West has very publicly struggled with mental illness, and it's addressed in a way that I have not seen, you know, years, like I wouldn't say like 10 years earlier as explicitly, and certainly in hip hop. And I'm curious. I mean, again, maybe maybe R&B, maybe gospel, maybe country music, pop, maybe K-pop. They're talking about mental health also in the same levels. I don't know, but I do know that hip hop definitely has done that very, very explicitly in the last. It's come up a lot with a lot of artists, Kendrick Lamar and others. And so can you talk a little bit about like do you see a sort of a shift in some ways with artists, musical artists being much more open and explicit about mental health, the need for it, addressing their own struggles?
Yeah, I would definitely say there's a major shift happening since the start of the pandemic. The ways in which people are consuming music right now fundamentally looks different than it did 2 years ago. The ways in which people are making music looks different. You're starting to hear more up-tempo, more house music being made by the Kaytronadas of the world, the Beyoncés, the Weekends, the Drakes, to promote more positive mental health as we're still going through this ongoing pandemic. At the same time, we've had artists communicate, we'd rather sign a deal with Spinach over a major label because there are access to mental health resources in a way that these larger labels would just prefer to sweep it under the rug, brush it by the wayside. So yeah, I think there's a level of individual artists seeing in themselves that mental health is another part of the artist's checkbox, and it's also just as important as the music itself or the visuals to their artistry. Recognizing that we can focus on the artist before, during, and after the creative process so that they're not feeling like they're being discarded after this art is made. Simultaneously, they have a support system if they do reach a pinnacle of success that they're unfamiliar with. If there's a bout of depression where they're having imposter syndrome, I've really, 3 or 4 years ago, communicated to Brandon, like, I want to make sure that we have a space for you that is solely focused on your artistry and your music and has nothing to do with basketball. And cultivating that space and circumventing the major label industry has allowed him to exist in all of these spaces simultaneously. So there's definitely a massive shift towards labels starting to recognize that there needs to be more of a precedent on mental health resources. And that's only going to be built out by independent labels that aren't being controlled by the big three. Those would include Sony Entertainment, Warner Music Group, and Universal, yes. Sorry. And so you'll start to see it from the outside in, and then work its way